So as I said, the rule of law, the term is not always used in the way in which it is best defined. And sometimes it's used for bad motives to actually promote authoritarianism under the guise of rule of law. So what is it? It really, in its best definition, it's a durable system of laws, institutions, norms, and community commitment that delivers on these four major functions: accountability. The government and private actors are accountable under law, and the laws are just, and they are applied evenly, and they protect human rights as well as property, contract, and procedural rights. And government is open, and the laws are enforced openly, and the processes by which the law is adopted, administered, adjudicated, enforced are accessible, fair, and efficient. And very importantly, justice is delivered timely by competent, ethical, and independent representatives and neutrals who have adequate resources, are accessible, and reflect the communities they serve. So next slide. We have, since we began in 2009 as our own separate entity, we found that there's lots of entities and different types of platforms that use our data to improve. Our founders, Bill Newcomb, has often said that our first prize is government reform. And we have worked closely with a number of countries over the years. As they see our data, they invite us to supply them with additional data to better understand how they can improve. So that's always an important achievement for us and an important goal that we keep front and center. You see there are a number of multilateral organizations and NGOs that rely on our data and use it, and we consult with them and advise them. We have been getting more and more coverage about our data in the Rule of Law Index from various media outlets, certainly on social media, but also from some well-established media platforms, as you see in this particular slide. And more businesses are saying, we want to do business in areas where we can rely on the enforceability of contracts, and to make sure that we have an environment where we can succeed in what we're trying to accomplish for our business and our business plans. Next. As I mentioned, what we're launching here today is a campaign to strengthen the rule of law in the United States. You'll hear more in just a moment from Alejandro Ponce about the data in the United States. But clearly, since 2016, there's been a decline. There's been a little slight improvement in 2022. But overall, we've seen a decline over the last 5 years on the rule of law in the United States. So what we're trying to do is we'll be conducting some research and analysis about the rule of law in the United States. We'll be reaching out to other entities to collaborate with us. We want to promote the best practices in strengthening the rule of law. And we will be working and looking for partners to build capacity and support local leaders to stand up for the rule of law principles. And I'll have more opportunities on how we can all work together at the end of this particular panel today. So with one other announcement, please go ahead and start as you hear these presentations. Please proceed to go ahead and put your questions in the chat. And at the end of this program today, we will have an opportunity to try to answer as many of those questions as we can. So with that, I'll ask Alejandro Ponce, our Chief Research Officer, to present the index, the Rule of Law Index, the main global findings, and the United States specifics uncovered in the latest iteration of the Rule of Law Index. Alex?
Thank you very much, William. Let me share my screen. Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm going to present the results of the Rule of Law Index in the United States. First, to begin, William mentioned the definition of the World Justice Project that the World Justice Project uses about the rule of law, and the Rule of Law Index operationalized this definition through a set of 8 outcome indicators or factors that essentially summarize these principles that William mentioned on limits on the arbitrary use of power by authorities and citizens. And we organize this in 8 factors: constraints on government powers, absence of corruption, open government, fundamental rights, order and security, regulatory enforcement, civil justice, and criminal justice. Each one of these factors is further disaggregated into sub-factors or sub-indicators that essentially capture some of the elements or outcomes that rule of law societies want to achieve. For example, when we talk about civil justice systems, we consider whether the justice systems are accessible, free of discrimination, free of corruption, free of government influence, and so on. In this year's report, essentially we collect information for 140 countries. The way that we gather the information is through 2 data sources. So one is households or people, lay citizens, and the other one is legal practitioners all around the world or experts in 4 disciplines. For this year's report, we collected information from more than 150,000 people around the world and 3,600 experts, as I mentioned, in different disciplines. The period of data collection was between February 2022 and June 2022. As I mentioned, 8 factors and 44 sub-factors, and we organized the information in questionnaires that essentially just give us the variables that make up the index, over 550 perception and experience-based questions that we map into the sub-factors and then the factors to come up with the indicators and the scores, which are comparable across countries and across time. All the information is presented in country profiles, so you can check all this information for the 44 sub-factors, the factors, trends over time, both in the report. There is a PDF, but also on the website where you can look at your specific country and how the country has been performing over time, as well as some global insights. So before getting into the results of the US that are going to spark our conversation, let me just show you the context where we can situate the rule of law findings for the US and talk about some of the global trends that we saw this year. First, the rule of law declined in 61% of the countries between last year and this year. So as we will see, this is still a larger number of countries that declined and improved. This is a little bit better than last year when we were hit by the pandemic, but still it's a negative trend. And this can be explained by 3 factors. So the first factor is weakening of checks and government powers or checks and balances. The indicators, the scores for these indicators declined in 58% of the countries last year. Second is a decline in the indicator on respect for fundamental rights. This indicator fell in 66% of the countries, driven mainly by declines in freedom of the media, freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of assembly, as well as rising discrimination. And finally, just a decline in 61% of the countries on the effectiveness of the civil justice systems, mainly driven by weak enforcement and continuous delays from last year. Now, looking at long-term trends, we have been collecting this information for several years, so we can see that what we are observing between last year and this year is really just part of a longer-term trend that we have been observing for several years. Between 2015 and 2022, 64% of the countries have declined in the rule of law scores, driven mainly by declines in constraints on government powers and fundamental rights. This chart shows the percentage of countries that have declined and improved, declined in red and improved in blue since 2015. As you can see, this year, 61% of the countries declined. This is a reduction as compared to last year, in which 74% of the countries declined, but still the number of countries that declined is much larger than the number of countries that improved. So that's the context where we can situate some of the findings of the US. Now, going specifically to the results of the US. So first, the US ranks 26th out of 140 countries in rule of law. So you can see there, this is the table for countries within the EU, EFTA, North America region, where the US ranks 19 out of 31 with a score of 0.71. Just the perfect score is 1. The weakest score is 0, and improved 1 position. So if we look at how the US has performed since 2015, so this is the growth rate over the years where we have the index score. So a blue bar is a positive growth rate from during that year, and a red bar is a negative trend. As we can see, the US improved last year, but it comes from a deterioration since 2016 in rule of law scores, and particularly in factor 1, which measures checks and balances. So in 2015-16, there was an improvement, but then starting 2016 up to 2020, so we observe a decline, in some cases considerable, so of about 5% on average in factor 1 during those years, with a slight improvement during the previous year. So if we look at some of the components that are driving these findings, we can probably just organize them in 3 findings. So the first one is about checks on government powers, just by institutional checks. First by the legislator, the judiciary, independent audit and review, and the indicator of measuring sanctions for misconduct or accountability. So the first one, as we can see, legislative constraints have been declining for all this period. Then judicial constraints, which essentially is a proxy for judicial independence, declined particularly between 2016 and 2020, improved a little bit in the last year. And the same applies for independent audit and review that measures just whether independent institutions can indeed audit effectively the government, human rights, ombudsman, financial institutions, financial irregularities, and so on. And it's the same pattern. We observed a decline between 2016 and 2020 with a rebound last year, but still just the rebound hasn't, the country hasn't been able to catch up with the decline that suffered over the previous years. And finally, accountability, just the pattern remains, just not a huge rebound, indeed, just essentially stagnation during the previous year. So the second point to contextualize this is government powers subject to non-governmental checks. Essentially, this is freedom of the media, freedom of civil society, political parties to express opinions, and so on, which is a diagonal accountability measure, and a kind of the same pattern that we saw as before, decline between 2016 and 2021. In some cases, a very marked decline on almost 10%, particularly in 2020. Finally, an indicator of transition of power subject to the law that saw a decline, particularly between 2016 and 2020, and a rebound in 2020 and 2021. This shows factors such as confidence in the electoral system or the checks and balances within the electoral system, access to ballot, and so on, that again declined just up to 2020 and improved in 2021 and 2022. Just another phase of elections, just this, if we look at these pictures, essentially this shows the countries that improved the most during the previous year. And the United States is among the top performers of last year with an increase in rule of law in 1.8%. Interestingly, 3 out of the 5 countries that improved had elections and a change in administration that could explain this change. Finally, of course, there was a change last year, but there is still a long way to go. So these are the scores between 2015 and 2022 for each one of the different factors and the overall rule of law score. So we can see that in all of them, even though there has been a rebound the previous year, in all the scores, there's still just some way to go from where we were in 2015. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, just the scores, particularly in factor 1, factor 4, factor 7, and factor 8 are still lower than what we will expect. And in some cases, there are structural issues there that have been an ongoing concern in the US, particularly I will point at three, just as part of these indicators. So the first one is discrimination. So in discrimination, the US ranks 103 out of 140. So that's included in the factor of fundamental rights. The second one is access to justice. Inaccessibility of justice systems, which is an indicator of part of factor 7, access to civil justice. The US ranks 115 out of 140. And finally, discrimination both in the civil and the criminal justice system. In the civil justice system, the US ranks 121 out of 140, and in criminal justice system, 106 out of 140. So these are structural challenges that the US has been facing for several years since we started collecting data, and that they still just need to be addressed. And with this, I'm going to stop. Thank you, William. Back to you.
Alex, thank you very much. President Deborah Enix-Ross of the American Bar Association has been focused on many of these issues through her Cornerstones of Democracy program, which is designed to strengthen the rule of law and also promote civility in the United States. So, Deborah, you've made addressing some of these negative trends a big part of your work this year. And so based on what you've heard today and your own observations and research, what concerns you most about the rule of law in the United States?
Thank you, William. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about what we call in the ABA the cornerstones of democracy, which are civics, civility, and collaboration. And this grew out of seeing the trends that have just been described with the lack of understanding in our country, the divisions in our country over many issues. You pick an issue, whether it's voting rights or policing or public health, climate change, whatever it might be. And what we've seen is that a lack of civic education, and I'm careful to say when I'm talking to a US audience, I talk about civics, but if this were an international, and for those who may not be from the US, you could substitute the word civics and put in civilization or citizenship, and it's the same kinds of concepts. But the lack of civic education, which had been for a long time a critical vehicle for students to learn about democracy and the principles of civil discourse. And so we've seen that lack of civics education, which also provides grounding in critical thinking and fact-based debate, those are core elements of democracy. And we've been lacking in that for a number of years. And so the outcome of decades of disinvestment in civics education is what you're seeing reflected in the WJP index, which is a lack of understanding of American rights, of government institutions and government processes and how they are supposed to work. And just to underscore some of the problems that we've seen in the ABA, for many know that the ABA has its own civics survey. It's an annual survey. And in 2022, what we saw was that overall, people, more than half of people agreed with the statement that the justice system has racial bias built into its rules, procedures, and practices. So that for me is alarming, and even more so because more young people, so people ages 18 to 34, 63% of them said that there was racial bias in the system. And then Black people saw racial bias at a higher level than other groups, while half of white respondents, 48%, saw racial bias, 54% of Hispanic people did, and 75% of Black people responded that there's racial bias in the justice system. So with that in mind, we really need to refocus on promoting civics education, promoting civility. And when we talk about civility, it's not that we're saying that people need to be weak in expressing their advocacy, but they need to be able to have civil discourse in order to be more productive. And so in the ABA, that's why we've been focused on these areas over this last year.
So you certainly identified a number of issues, Deborah. What are some of the specific programs that the ABA is engaged in to address these problems, these issues?
So taking a page from the WJP, and of course, I've long been involved with the WJP, the third C that I talked about was collaboration. And so one of the things that we're focused on is recognizing that although it is the legal profession's role to lead in these areas, it's not exclusively our purview or responsibility. We have to partner with other stakeholders. So whether they are business leaders or faith leaders, journalists in particular, all of us are stakeholders in promoting civics and civility and collaboration. So the power that the ABA has is as a convening authority. We're working with our state and local bars, we're working with other associations to give people the tools that they need in terms of, especially with civility. We have resource tools to how to facilitate difficult conversations. We have civics training materials, all of that available on our website. And we're hoping that people will take advantage of that, use the resources that we provide, and start to have these conversations in their local communities on issues that impact them, and try to restore what I call the fourth C, which is confidence in our democratic institutions.
And of course, one of the issues that has been identified, you've alluded to the discrimination in the criminal justice system, and another factor that's held back the United States is access to justice on the civil side. And you might want to describe what the ABA does in terms of access to justice and its promotion for support for the Legal Services Corporation. That sustained effort over many years.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. Obviously, we have, since its inception, supported Legal Services Corporation every year. We advocate on behalf of funding for legal services. I've made it my own personal goal, having started out as a legal services lawyer, to visit legal services offices wherever I travel to different cities. But it's more than reaching out to our legal services colleagues and thanking them for the hard work that they do, which is important to do that, I think. But it's also advocating for funding for legal services. We also have many pro bono efforts within the ABA, including being able to have people ask questions and have volunteers who will respond to those questions. That's one of our ways of trying to narrow that justice gap. And we're reaching over close to 250,000 answers, legal answers that have been provided for free to people who have legal questions. And that's all done through the volunteers, ABA members that volunteer to answer those questions. So it's some things that we're doing. There's more that is needed, but that's a start.
And of course, factor 4 in the index is basically talks of an independent, impartial judiciary. And again, that's been the focus for the ABA for a number of years. So it's been a sustained effort.
Yeah, that's true. And even most recently, we've created a task force on, it's called Law, Society, and the Judiciary. And it really it came out of the idea that the most recent Supreme Court decisions have left a lot of people feeling that the court is not as impartial as we have seen in the past. So this task force is designed to, first of all, look at what we can do as an association to underscore the need for an independent judiciary, the need for safe judiciary. We don't want attacks on judges. And then what concrete steps we can take as a legal community to, again, restore confidence in an independent judiciary.
Deborah, you mentioned you emphasize the importance of collaboration. Maybe you can close by suggesting to us what all of us can do working together. How might we achieve a better result?
I think there are a number of things that we can do. Look, everyone's, and not every action is going to be for every person. The ABA have been partnering with states attorney generals and something called Poll Worker Esquire, and we were asking lawyers and law students to serve as poll workers in this last election. And I'd been going around talking about that and decided, well, if I'm talking about it and encouraging others to do it, I should do it myself. So I did. I served as a poll worker in my local district and ward, and I'm happy to talk about that experience at another time. But that's just one thing that I did. And I will say that it was very interesting to have my neighbors, because as I say, it was my ward and my district, come and almost breathe a sigh of relief, thinking that there was going to be fairness. They could see that their neighbors, see the people that were poll workers or just like them, who are coming in and trying to make sure that there was a free and fair election and that everybody who was eligible to vote could vote. So that's one thing. But there are other things, including, you might host a leaders' night in your local community, and have people come and understand and explain to them what government is meant to do and what it's not meant to do. You can provide conversations about difficult topics and host that. And I think there are skills that we have in particular as lawyers to be able to do that. But those are some of the things that each one of us can do. And if you go to our website, Cornerstones of Democracy at the ABA, we've got a lot of information and other ideas of what you can do.
Deborah, thank you so much for those insights and those suggestions. David Carroll is director of the Democracy Program at the Carter Center. And we'd be very interested, David, in learning from you or getting your reaction to the World Justice Project Index data, and how might it square with what you at the Carter Center are seeing in the United States?
Thank you, William. Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Two things to say at the outset. So, we've been working internationally on elections and democracy for more than 30 years, but our work in the U.S. has only been the last several years, since a little before 2020. And so, my comments on the U.S. are, caveated by this limited experience in terms of direct engagement in the United States. But what I can say from our international experience, we look at elections and democracy from the perspective of international standards based on human rights, public international law, and assessing countries' processes from that perspective. And it's long been apparent to us at the Carter Center that the U.S. had several areas where we were not meeting standards, frankly, and we're far behind many other countries. And a lot of it has to do with access and inclusion in the electoral process, and also the independence of institutions that administer elections and that do redistricting, for example, and also some problems in just sort of the representation and the effective representation of government elected officials. So I would say, in the United States in particular, the fact that we don't have a single strong national election body that administers elections uniformly across the country has resulted in a situation where there's a patchwork of election authorities across the country with widely different rules. And it can be very difficult, especially for persons of lower classes, persons of color, to have full access to the voting process, voter ID laws, voter registration obstacles. And in most countries in the world that are advanced democracies, there's a more level, uniform approach, and those obstacles can be addressed more uniformly. And so that's definitely a problem from a comparative global perspective. Similarly, in most countries will have strong democracies will have an independent election administration central body that will be administering elections nationally with subunits across the country. Again, we have a very patchwork system. In many cases, it's elected partisan officials who at least are sitting on top of the bodies that administer elections. And even if they're not directly engaged in election administration, the perception that there could be some political influence can present a problem. Partisan election of judges is also a problem compared to international practice. And then when you link that with areas that much of the world struggles with, which is campaign finance and lack of effective regulation of campaign finance and the flow of money, and media coverage, many countries struggle in those areas, as does the United States, in ensuring a more level playing field around our elections. All of that has led to a context where, as we've seen, there is, over the last several years, last 5 years or more in the US, growing questions about confidence in our elections and in trust in election authorities and in the outcomes. And in particular, concern about the bedrock norm of commitment to a peaceful transfer of power. And when that is threatened, I think your core principles of democracy and democratic legitimacy are at serious risk.
David, thank
William,
you.
could I
Yes,
just
please.
just pick up on one of David's points? When I mentioned I worked as a poll worker, what I found amongst many things interesting is the number of people that came in and automatically presented identification. And I live in New Jersey, so I was serving as a poll worker in New Jersey, which does not require identification. And in fact, we're not allowed in the training, we're not allowed to ask for identification except for like 3 or 4, specific circumstances. But it was, to me, an indication that the messaging about, voter fraud and voter ID and all of that was really resonating with people. So they were automatically coming in and presenting their idea. And some of them were taken aback when we say, not only do you not need to do it, I can't look at it, I don't want to look at it, you're not required to show that to me. So I think that there is this mixed messaging. And it's certainly, based on just that, my own county and what was going on in the ward that I'm in versus other wards, and it wasn't always as clear to the voters what was needed and what was not needed, and a number of them had come in and were sent to us because they had tried to vote in different places. So just that alone can really encourage distrust of the system, and unless you have people who are very well trained to be able to diffuse some of that, you can see how that would manifest itself.
Thank you, Deborah. Again, a reminder to please put any questions you have in the chat. We'll have time at the conclusion of this to answer your questions. So, David, returning to you and drawing on your decades of experience strengthening democracy around the world, what recommendations do you have for the United States, for us in the United States, to strengthen the rule of law and our democracy?
Thanks, William. A couple of things. I think, most immediately, I think a lot of people are aware of the Electoral Count Act and the importance of passing that. But I think, what we've seen in the last couple election cycles, especially around the 2020 elections, and the ambiguities in the law there and the opportunities that presented to hinder a peaceful transfer of power, I think that's really an essential first reform and step to take to try to get us back on a path where we close some of those loopholes. A number of other things longer term. Some of the legislation in Congress last year that was really going to support better election administration, more transparent elections, and Voting Rights Act. in particular would be really important to find some ways to restore some of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act that can really address some of the access issues and those inequalities across states about voter access. So something like that, I think, would be really essential. And then longer term things that would go toward the independence of institutions connected to election processes. It will be, I think, difficult for there to be a large scale move across the US, for there to be independent election authorities in all of the states, because of the processes are very familiar and entrenched politically. But I do think it's worth continuing to explore ways to have more independent election authorities, make it not a partisan elected official that sits at the top of whatever is the structure. And similarly, more efforts to try to build independent redistricting processes. A couple of states have those, but and the experiences haven't been always good. But I think we need to move more in that direction if we're going to try to get away from the kind of gerrymandered districts, which then hinders the effective representation of people. We've got to get to a spot where there's more ability for there to be independence in that process, so we can get greater competition and real effective representation. I think several of the states that have moved to ranked choice voting is another way to get better outcomes on elections that are going to help move in that direction. And then lastly, I would say, well, two other things. Campaign finance reform is always a real big challenge, but I think in this election that just occurred in November, I know that Arizona passed a referendum on their ballot that's going to require some transparency for candidates. And more efforts in different states to try to do that, to build momentum, to shed a light on where the money is going to be really important. And we haven't talked at all here, touched on the question of misinformation and all the ways that has fed into the questions about confidence in the elections and really understanding what's happening around elections. I think Deborah's point about people engaging in the polls. We need these windows of transparency where people can understand elections based on factual information, and what's on the internet is just really making it so much more complicated for people to have an accurate understanding of what happens around elections. And there's another bill in Congress that many people will be familiar with, the Platform Transparency and Accountability Act. It would be one initial step to allow there to be more research access to the data that the social media platforms have access to about all of us and what we do in our lives, that we know very little about what they know about us. So I think all of those are things that I would urge be considered going forward.
David, following up on the redistricting commissions, you noted that they have not been entirely successful. Why not, and what can be done to improve that process?
I'm not too deeply familiar with some of the experiences about what led to them not being so effective. I think Wisconsin is maybe the one where there's some problems. I'm sure some folks listening here will probably know more about that particular case. It probably has a lot to do with some of the politics involved in the process to put it together. But what we know from our international experience is, if you have an independent institution and you have a good process of selecting that, over time, you're going to have a better set of outcomes. You just don't want to have officials who have a partisan interest. Even if you have some way of trying to balance that, that would help if there's more political balance in the redistricting process. But getting more a formula built where there's independent experts involved, so that it's not going to be totally gerrymandered, which both parties are guilty of and will continue to be guilty of going forward.
And one other factor, you mentioned the social media platforms. I've been reading a lot lately about the way the algorithms are set up to drive people to their corners, to make them, as they perceive to be in one direction or another, to drive them farther and farther to the right or to the left, so that they become even more convinced of their position and less open to a full discussion of what the facts really are.
Sure. No, I think that's increasingly we're much more in agreement, I think, now as a society on the nature of the problem. But now we've got to really figure out how to address this in a way that, is going to be acceptable to Americans. We're not going to want to take too deep of an attack to overly regulate online content, but we need to do something, because there really is very little being done to effectively give citizens the ability to know what's known about them online, and to somehow have some minimal set of regulations on that, I would think.
David, thank you very much. I think now we have a few minutes for questions from the chat. And so Betsy, if you can choose some of those, we'll assign them to our panelists and go from there.
Sure. A first question about the data. Are you capturing data on election issues from the citizen viewpoint, as in many lawsuits and allegations of illegal voting or corrupt electoral systems? Is this included in the WJP index?
Alex, that's for you.
Yes, very quickly. Yes, it is included. We have a few questions that we asked to the public about elections. In particular, we asked them about just whether the elections are clean, or whether local government officials are elected through a clean process. And that one, we saw a decline. I mean, just the pattern that I showed before just shows a similar pattern when we look at the citizens data, so that it has declined between 2016, 2020, improved a little bit over the previous year. The other one is a question on whether people can vote freely without being harassed. And that one has been as well declining just over the years, probably a little bit more pronounced than the other question. But yes, we ask these questions, and there are differences as well, just when we start splitting these questions by demographics and political affiliation and so on, that show some interesting patterns.
Thank you. Betsy?
Another question, this one I think is directed to Deborah. Does the ABA have community outreach to local authorities, cities, and at the county level, besides the resources that are made available online?
So the answer is yes, through our connections to state and local bar associations. And I've been really gratified with the number of them that are focused on civics and civility. This year in particular, I think people are seeing, this is a problem that is across the country, and the solutions are going to be those that are really local. What we're trying to do is provide the information. So even in our civics training materials, they are not designed to be partisan. They are really designed to help people understand the roles, the three branches of government, what the roles are, what the branches of government are meant to do and not meant to do, and to try and teach that in a way that is, as I say, nonpartisan. I was going to say non-threatening, but I think anything can be perceived as partisan, and then that's part of the difficulty. We just talked about essentially the echo chambers, where people can only get information and the views that they want to hear. But these materials are designed to help with the critical thinking about information, and also about disinformation. So that's how we do it, through our partnership at the local levels.
William, we have a couple of questions that go to civic education and outreach to broad publics. Timothy Isaacs from the Center for Teaching the Rule of Law notes that at Roanoke College, they have a program of collaborating with local bar associations to provide volunteers to work with educators to teach the rule of law in civics programs to students in Virginia. So that could be one model folks want to look at. Mike Pates from the ABA Center for Human Rights poses a question. He notes that in their work, they've seen at times that issues relating to law can be intimidating to non-lawyers, and therefore left to lawyers and their specialized expertise, which has an isolating effect. And he'd like to hear from the panel ways in which this perception can be overcome and true collaboration better achieved. beyond the legal profession.
Who would like to take that among you? Deborah, David?
Sure, I can start, and then we'll have the benefit of David's wisdom too. So actually, when I began to think about the cornerstones of democracy, it was because of the number of non-lawyers that were approaching me and asking questions about the process, which essentially were rule of law questions. And they didn't have the language, they weren't calling it rule of law, but they were trying to understand essentially the rule of law. And that's why for me, it has been important to bring in non-lawyers in as part of this conversation. And because I was a journalism major and have a degree in broadcast journalism, it was especially important for me to have journalists as part of this conversation, because I think it is really harmful when journalists use the description of Trump appointed judge or Biden appointed judge or any kind of descriptor in that way. It reinforces the notion, okay, well, this judge is not going to be impartial because of who appointed them. And we really got to come to grips with how damaging that is. So working with journalists, working with teachers, working in our local communities, because it's really all about trust at the local level. We've seen that time and time again, providing people on the local level the resources that they need, and speaking to audiences and groups in ways that resonate with them. It's not the same language for every audience, but slowly understanding what resonates with this audience and this community. Getting to that point, I think, is how we do it. It's slow, and it can be frustrating at times, but I think we all agree that protecting the rule of law and democracy is worth it.
Thank you. Betsy?
William, we have another kind of communications question that goes to the administration of elections, and that is Judy Perry Martinez notes that at least in her jurisdiction, it's typically older citizens, and particularly women, often Black women, who serve as the poll workers and ensure election integrity. And she wonders if you all have any ideas on messages that have been so successful in reaching and encouraging women to serve in that role, and why they failed so miserably with men, who often without hesitation step up to run for office, but not to serve as poll workers, and also reaching younger individuals to play this kind of a role. Wondering whether those same types and tone of messages could be effective in engaging others in our democracy, whether as poll workers or in other capacities. Thoughts about that?
Deborah, you want to take that one as well?
Hey, Deborah, I'll go after you.
Sure. Well, clearly I fit the role, except I don't know about the older Black woman part, but okay. But what I was encouraged by this election cycle, when I did my training, I looked around the room and it felt like the United Nations. It was everyone from every walk of life. There were young people, there were retirees, there were clearly, people who were professional and other people who maybe were not professionals, but everybody was invested in. Some people were there because they were like, I want to make sure that the election isn't stolen. So they signed up and they're going to work. But for whatever the motivation, they were there for that reason. I think, it's not easy being a poll worker. For me, it's dedication, because you get up you have to be there at 5 a.m. The polls open at 6, and you have to stay until 8 p.m. when they close in New Jersey. And so I think there's a bit of that, but I think we need to advertise to people where they are. So whether it is TikTok or whether if we want younger people, we've got to go to the colleges, we've got to encourage them to do it. And for men, I think, especially for Black men, we got to go to the barbershops, and we have to say to them, this is important and this is why it's important. And as I say, the messaging has to be different for different targeted audiences. But I think I suspect that there will be more people signing up for the 2024 election, because we've seen the results in 2022. I think more people will want to be a part of working and ensuring that there's a free and fair election. So maybe I'm an optimist, but I do think that more people will sign up for 2024.
David?
Yeah, I agree with everything Deborah's mentioned. I would maybe just emphasize too, I saw one of the comments, just national civic education in general is going to be really helpful for people to understand the process, get more interested in it, find ways that they can engage in it directly. Maybe longer term, because it will require, change of our laws or constitution, I guess. Most of the rest of the world has a national holiday for elections, which makes it a whole lot easier. And short of that, just kind of recognition of national service in ways that can make it easy for people who don't have to just be, retired or elderly or, some other folks that can do this. It should be recognized as a national holiday and or at a minimum, some kind of national service so that it's easier for folks to do this and to participate. Again, around the world, when we observe elections on election day, everything is closed down, and people they're going to vote, they're going to participate. We make it, you got to squeeze it into your busy work day, and the people who are going to work there have to also try to find a way to build this into their lives. It's the exact wrong way to try to get genuine, inclusive participation in your election process. One other thing I would maybe suggest is, it's in a particular interest of the Carter Center, is expanding people's involvement in nonpartisan election observation. This is another thing that we see around most of the world. There are citizens groups that do election observation, in addition to party representatives, party agents that we're all familiar with at polling stations. And it's a way for citizens to engage in the election process, to understand it, and to be part of building confidence that they're also able to see this, directly inside polling stations and watch. It's not just that time when you go in and you cast your ballot, but you're there all day. You get to see the process. You get to understand it. You see how all the parts connect. So ways to move the United States in the direction that most of the rest of the world has this civic engagement around elections.
Thank you, David. Betsy?
William, a couple of comments and questions relating to legislation to address rule of law issues. House Bill 23, which is aims at protecting inspectors general from arbitrary dismissal. Question is whether there's any update on that legislation the panel might know, and also a plug for the supporting the Civics Secures Democracy Act, which is supposed to increase investment in K-12 civics education. I don't know if the panel want to speak to that, but maybe a final question that folks could use to sum up is identifying the top 3 things you'd like to see state, local, and affinity bars do to engage their members on this subject.
Deborah, you want to take that one? You're
Sure.
in connection with state and local bars every day.
Sure. So the one, it would be going into local schools and talking about the rule of law and civics. I mean, we have Law Day in 2023. We're going to feature civics as part of Law Day. So plan now to, I would love to see an army of legal professionals going across communities and schools talking about civics, talking to students, talking to their parents, talking to communities. So that's one. Partner with other organizations. I'm a member of a number of women's organizations, the Links and Jack and Jill and all kinds of community organizations. You don't have to do this by yourself. You can partner with other associations to get the word out. And then the third would be use your skills to facilitate civil discourse and model what that looks like, even in difficult conversations.
Thank you, Deborah. David, any closing comment?
I think I'll just agree with Deborah. I think she's covered it in ways that much better than I could.
Alex, any final word?
No, nothing to add to that.
All right. Well, thank you all. I'd really like to thank our panelists. You've really enlightened us today, and we really appreciate your sharing your thoughts and recommendations. Let me just invite all of you on this call today to work with us. We're in this Rebuilding Trust campaign. We're looking for partners, and we're looking for folks and entities to collaborate with to make common calls in this initiative. So please contact Betsy Anderson if you're willing to offer your services and that of your organization. And also, if you have any interest in donating to this effort, we'll certainly accept your monetary contributions as well. But our main priority is to build a network of entities and individuals working together hand in hand to strengthen the rule of law in the United States. And we at the World Justice Project want to be a convener, working with entities like the American Bar Association, and we've already started that process, as well as working with the National Conference of Bar Presidents, which they've agreed to collaborate on this program for the next 2 years. So we have that commitment in hand, and we welcome other organizations and entities. Thank you all for your participation today. We're all in this together. We look forward to working with you over the course of the coming months and years. So to a stronger rule of law in the United States. Take care. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.